Now, if you come to Abbotsford House and you come into Sir Walter Scott's great library, you will find an octagonal table with a glass top. Now, that table contains a great many curious treasures, and one of them is called the toadstone. The toadstone belonged to Sir Walter Scott's mother, and if any woman was about to have a child, or had just had a child, she would ask if she could borrow it to keep them safe from the fairies. Because in those days, a lot of people, especially those who lived in country places, still believed very much in the fairy folk, and they knew to take care. Now, the story that I'm going to tell you is just the sort of story that a young Walter Scott would have heard as a child with his grandparents in the farm at Smailholm. This story is called Wee Johnnie. A long time ago, but not so very far from here, there lived a young couple called Jock and Tibby Tampson. Now, they lived in a little house way up in the hills. They had a couple of cows and they farmed a couple of fields. But the pride and joy of their lives was their wee laddie, wee Johnnie. Johnnie was a lovely wee chap. He was all podgy and he had bright blue eyes and curly hair, and he was always smiling. He drank all his milk and he never really seemed to cry, which is a great thing in a bairn. Now, every day Jock would go away to work in the fields and Tibby would be busy working around the house. But even if she was tired or had a sore back, she was never lonely, because all she had to do was to lean into the cradle and there would be her wee Johnnie, smiling and chuckling and playing with his toes. He was the heart and soul of the house. Now, this one day, Tibby was away up through the cow yard with a bucket to get some water from the well, when all of a sudden she heard the most horrible noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a pig being killed. She dropped the bucket and she ran as fast as she could back to the house, and there was the cradle rocking wildly from side to side, with the blankets going this way and that way, and little arms and legs flailing around, and the noise was blood-curdling. She leaned in, but what was this? This didn't look like her wee Johnnie. The face was all wizened and sallow, and had two great big eyes like marbles sticking out of his head. And his mouth, it looked like a great slash from ear to ear. It looked more like a toad's mouth than her own baby's mouth. And the noise, nya, nya, nya. Oh, it was awful. Tibby leaned in and she took the child on her shoulder and she walked round and round the kitchen trying to soothe it down. And eventually, after a long, long time, she put the baby back into the cradle and she had to wipe an angry tear from his face. And I'm afraid to say she had to wipe a few tears from her own face too, because she feared that maybe the fairies had been and put a spell on her own child. Well, that was the way it was for Jock and Tibby from then on. All day long, all night long, they never got a moment's peace or quiet. It was nya, nya, nya the whole time. They couldn't sleep, they couldn't rest, they couldn't work. And it wasn't long until the farm started to go right to rack and ruin. So one day Tibby thought she would ask their near neighbour over the hill, Walter Grieve, if he would come over and sit with the bairn so they could go to market and see if they could get something done. Now, Walter Grieve was a very kind old man, and he was a nice old man because he was a tailor by trade. And you'll know that in those days, tailors would go round to this farm and to that house and to that farm, and they would make or mend clothes according to whatever you wanted. And along the way they would bring the gossip and the news and pick up all sorts of interesting bits of information. And Walter Grieve, well, he knew a bit about the fairy folk. So the very next day, Walter came over to the house and he brought a jacket with him because he had to put some buttons on the jacket. So Walter sat down and he put the jacket on his knee and he started to sew away with the buttons. Jock and Tibby made a big show. They got themselves organised and out of the door to the market. So there he was, sewing on the buttons, nice and peaceful. When all of a sudden he heard, "Is my mother and father awa?" He looked around and couldn't see anything, so he carried on working. "Is my mother and father awa?" He looked up from his work and, what was that? The wee thing in the cradle was sitting right bolt upright, and his big goggly eyes like marbles were rolling round in his head, and that mouth stretched from ear to ear, and two little hands gripping the side of the cradle. "Is my mother and father awa?" "Hi," said Jock. "Then get to the press and gi us a drink. There's whiskey in there." Well, Jock got up and he went to the press and he took down the bottle of whiskey and he took down a glass and he took down another glass as well because he felt he needed one too. And he poured out a couple of drams of whiskey and he handed one to the wee thing in the cradle. He snatched it and straight down. Walter sat down and drank his down too. And they sat there. And then the wee thing in the cradle started to blether. And he was blethering away. And the funny thing is, Walter was getting on quite well with him. They were having a good chat about this and that. And so they had another dram of whiskey. And they were chatting away until the wee thing said, "Gi us a tune." "Oh, I canna do that. I canna do that," said Walter. "Then get out to the byre and get us a straw from the stook," said the wee thing. So Walter got up and he went out of the kitchen, round the house into the byre, and there, sure enough, was the corn stack. So he pulled a big round corn straw out and he took it back round to the kitchen, and all the time he was saying to himself, "Oh, Watty, be careful now, for this is no ordinary bairn in the cradle." Went into the kitchen and he held out the corn straw to the wee thing in the cradle, and he snatched it off him and put it to his lips and dee 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 diddle dee diddle dee diddle dee dee diddle dee diddle dee dee. He played jigs and reels and strathspeys. It was the best music that Walter had ever heard. He was sitting there smiling away, tapping his foot, having a great time. Until the music stopped. There was a sound at the door. "Is that our mother and father hame?" And the wee thing in the cradle flipped back and nya, nya, nya. It was just the same as always. In came Jock and Tibby. Tibby came up to the cradle and went to tend the bairn, and Jock, he went out round to the byre to milk the cows, and Walter, he went with him. Now Walter told Jock everything that had happened since they went away, and Jock couldn't believe his ears. And Walter said that he knew, he was sure, that this was not their own wee Johnnie in the cradle. This was a fairy child. It was a changeling. And that if they wanted to get their own child back, they had to do what he told them to do. But it was so horrible and so unbelievable that Jock just couldn't face it. So Walter said that he would come back the next day and they must make as if they were going to go to market again, for they had still things to do, but instead they would creep round and come into the byre and listen at the wee keyhole and see what they could find. And if they knew that this was a changeling, they must do what he told Jock to do. So the next day, that's what happened. Back came Walter and he sat down. Tibby and Jock made a great show of going off to the market again. And as soon as they'd gone, they crept round to the back of the byre and in and to the keek-hole, and they listened. Well, it wasn't very long until they heard and then they knew straight away that Walter was telling the truth. So Jock collected up a big bag full of fresh cow dung and he carried it through to the kitchen and he put it onto the griddle and put it over the fire and made a big flames up underneath it. And all the while the wee thing in the cradle was gripping the side of the cradle and his eyes were going round and round in his head. But Jock didn't take any notice. He built up that fire until the kitchen was filled with the awful smell of cow dung and the smoke going away up the lum. And there's the wee thing in the cradle, gripping the cradle and looking wildly from here to there. But then when it was all red hot and sizzling, Jock turned round and grasped the thing in the cradle, but it wriggled and slipped out of his hands and rushed up the lum, screaming, "Deal, stick the lousy tailor!" And they heard the pitter-patter of tiny feet and whoosh. And then they heard a wee sound behind them, and they turned round, and there, in the cradle, was their own wee Johnnie, all podgy and plump and smiling, with bright blue eyes and curly hair, holding out his little hands to his mummy. And that was the end of all their troubles, and it is the end of that story.